Welcome to Pleasant Hills Community Presbyterian Church. More than 2 years ago, the Harmony Society began making plans for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the installation of the Chick Holtkamp organ in Pleasant Hills Church, culminating in a recital by Adam Brakel. Conditions caused that event to be postponed. But now, almost a year later, we will start over with a virtual presentation. I am Jim Stark, and I will be filling you in on the history of the organ, and then Michael Kearney will demonstrate the capabilities of this wonderful two-manual instrument. As a community, Pleasant Hills grew out of the housing boom of the late 1930s. There were few churches in the area, so the Presbyterians began meeting in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Leland Hubbs. By late 1939, this group felt confident enough to found a new church. On the left is Mrs. Hubbs in November 1939, in her Sunday finest, turning over the first shovelful of dirt. Mrs. Hubbs was also instrumental in founding the Pleasant Hills Library. On the right is the modest cinder block edifice that resulted. But after World War II, Pleasant Hills grew very rapidly, so by 1949, plans were begun for a new and larger sanctuary building. Here is a photo of the 1950 sanctuary taken during the closing choir program in 1967. By that time, we had almost 2,000 members and lots of kids. Notice first the divided chancel, which was typical of Presbyterian churches in the 30s and 40s. You also might see the 4 round grills in the ceiling just in front of the chancel, which we will talk about in a bit. Since this was to be a community church, the senior minister at the time, Paul Hudson, wanted it to include symbols of many Christian sects. So the high altar was set on the 7th of 7 steps representing the 7 Christian virtues. Above the altar was a judgment window, typical of Lutheran churches, and at the front a rood lamp, which we called a brotherhood lamp, since it contained symbols of the 3 largest religions, Christian, Judaic, and Islam. Notice also the choir members are wearing cassock and surplice, typical of the Episcopal Church. Whether there were insufficient funds for a new organ or whether someone thought they spotted a bargain, the organ that was installed was a turn of the 20th century 3-manual, approximately 25 rank Midmer, taken out of the First Lutheran Church of Altoona to make way for a Don Harrison Aeolian Skinner, which incidentally has recently been restored. The great swell and pedal were jammed into the small side chambers. The choir, which didn't fit, was intended to be placed over the chancel and speak through the 4 grills we mentioned earlier. However, the heating and ventilating folks got there first, and the choir had to be placed at the side of the attic, speaking through only one of the grills. The bad news, of course, was that it was always out of tune, but the good news was that you couldn't hear it anyway. The Midmer was installed by Morehouse, Bowman, and Brandt, then the Moeller representatives, and had a gorgeous 3-manual Moeller draw-knob console. But the rest was disappointing, both tonally and mechanically. In 1953, Victor Zook became the Moeller representative and made some recommendations, few of which were carried out. Then there was a Moeller rebuild proposal in 1956, and in 1958 a proposal for a new 3-manual for $37,000. Given costs at that time, it would probably have been a modest 20 to 25 rank organ. But other projects took precedence. In 1964, Bob Fraser came in as director of the Ministry of Music with the promise of a new organ. Bob had grown up in southern Ohio, did undergraduate work at the College of Worcester. After some military service during the Korean War, he completed a master's degree at Westminster Choir College, where he sang with the Westminster Choir that often performed with the New York Philharmonic. Then he took a church job in Chicago, where he also sang with the Chicago Symphony Chorus under its founding director, Margaret Hillis. He served Pleasant Hills for 20 years. In 1966, Session formed a new organ committee consisting of 9 members, 2 from Session, 2 from trustees, which was a separate board at that time, 2 from the adult choir, 2 from the congregation at large, and I was privileged to have been appointed chair. The committee traveled widely in western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and western New York, listening to organs, including a large Allen installation in Bradford, Pennsylvania. Along the way, a decision was made to select the builder and let the builder design the organ. Bob Fraser was a very competent keyboardist, but considered himself primarily a choral musician, so was comfortable with this. Mechanical action was considered, but a movable console seemed desirable. Support of congregational singing was considered to be the most important factor, and importantly, a recommendation was made to redesign the sanctuary to be more consistent with Presbyterian liturgy, which is traditionally word central rather than sacrament central, and the concept of the congregation gathering around the table, quite in vogue at that time, seemed appealing. So finally, after much deliberation, a decision was made to recommend Holtkamp as the builder. Chick Holtkamp was the 3rd generation Holtkamp to head the family firm, which is now overseen by his son, Chris. Chick graduated from Western Reserve Academy in 1946, the University of Chicago in 1950, spent some time in the Navy, and joined his father in 1956. Walter Sr. passed away in 1962, but at that time the firm had a 4 to 5 year backlog, so Chick really didn't come into his own until the late 60s. So here is the church as it appeared in 1970, set up for a recital. For regular services, the communion table would come forward and the organ console would be placed behind the reredos in front of the choir. The pulpit, lectern, and brotherhood lamp were retained, but notice that the pulpit was turned 45 degrees so the choir should see the preacher at least in profile. But how did a self-respecting, middle-class suburban church end up with a 2-manual organ? That is an interesting story. Just about the time we were finishing up our work, Chick Holtkamp published an article in the Diapason entitled "The 2-Manual Limited, An Approach to Integrity of Instrumental Form." This was a play on the word limited, which could mean not quite up to snuff or the most luxurious. He began by saying that according to conventional wisdom, 1-manual organs are for unbarbered professors and other eccentrics. 2-manual organs are for those who can't quite do right by their institution or church. 3-manual organs put one squarely in the middle class. A 4-manual is first class. A 5-manual was early retirement for the organ salesman, and so on up to a 7-manual Senator Richards. He was saying, of course, that the number of manuals does not determine the quality of the organ, but, in his opinion, each division should have a unique function, and each rank should have a unique function. This, however, does very much limit borrowing and extensions, which increases the cost of the organ. Some, given current practices, might agree with this approach, but as a listener, I find it very valid. In 1968, Chick Holtkamp walked into Pleasant Hill Church and announced that he would like to build a 2-manual organ, in spite of the fact that we were seeking 3-manual proposals. First, he may have been trying to prove a point since he had just written an article extolling the virtues of the 2-manual. But second, it made sense. We had limited space and a very dry acoustic. Aeolian Skinner had proposed a 3-manual 43 rank with a 6-rank antiphonal, including a 4-rank Joe Whiteford mixture, which probably would have lasted 2 weeks. In the final analysis, a compact instrument speaking down the axis of the room seemed the best decision, and more than 50 years later it still does. And finally, this was intended to be a liturgical organ and not principally a recital instrument. 51 years later, there have been no tonal changes, only minor mechanical repairs and no major re-leathering yet. The combination action has been upgraded to a Sindine 64-level solid-state system replacing the centerboard. For those interested, the Pleasant Hills organ is fully documented on the OHS database. It is too bad that we cannot get together and sing a hymn, but since I have said that we thought one of the most important functions of a liturgical organ in the Protestant Church was to support congregational singing, I would like you to hear 365 of my OHS friends in Pleasant Hills Church singing "A Stable Lamp is Lighted," with George Boëllmann accompanying.